Thank you. So actually, Bart started his presentation by talking about central and peripheral limitation to exercise. And I think we got some good example of the peripheral limitation with Olivier talking about the muscle response and the mechanical aspect of the sprint, and some good example of central responses with Bart talking about the brain. Now I have the task to talk about the boring part that is in between the two, the neural system. What do you have in between the brain and the muscle? I think all of you already saw this kind of study in which you have some EMG data being reported during cycling exercise or any kind of exercise, and showing that you have a lower EMG activity in hot ambient condition than in a temperate environment. And you observe the same thing if you do some maximal voluntary contraction in hyperthermic and normothermic subject. So you can see here that the hyperthermic subject in black have always a lower level of EMG activities than the normothermic subject. But then if you do the very simple experiment of simply changing the temperature of the skin during 2 minutes and the temperature of storage of the electrode by using a cool skin and cool electrode or warm skin and warm electrode, you also observe a decrement in EMG. And this is probably related to some methodological factors such as skin vasodilation at the level of the skin that will increase the resistance in between the muscle and the recording electrode. So the point is that actually you cannot rely on EMG in a hot ambient condition to estimate, to infer anything about the neural system. As a proof of that, here, even if we observe some lower RMS activity with a hot skin and hot electrode, the force was the same and the voluntary activation was the same. So it was simply a methodological issue. Sorry for the bad news. So if you want to have a better idea of what's happened at your neural system in hot ambient condition or with hyperthermia, you need to use some electrical stimulation of the peripheral nerve. And then you can dissociate about what is going on peripherally to the point of stimulation and what is going on proximally to the point of stimulation. One of the first landmark studies using this technique has been the one of Lars Nibo, published already back in 2011, in which he shows that in some hyperthermic participants post an exercise in hot ambient condition, you have a higher decrement in the force that you are able to sustain during a 2-minute maximal voluntary contraction. And that this higher decrement could be explained by a drop in voluntary activation. Following that, specifically the team of Stephen Chung has shown the same thing with passive hyperthermia with a study of Morrison in 2004 and Thomas in 2006, showing that the voluntary activation decrease with heating and then will re-increase with cooling. So what we can conclude is that with hyperthermia, we have a decrease in the neural drive reaching the muscle. But we don't know from where this failure is coming from. And it could come from a lot of different places. So that could be a failure from the motor cortex to generate the proper motor drive. But that can be a failure upstream of the motor cortex in driving the motor cortex itself. Or that could be some spinal modulation, or as well some failure of the peripheral nervous system. So to try to go a bit more into detail into that, when you do some peripheral stimulation, in addition of a mechanical response, what we call the twitch, we also observe an electrophysiological response, what we call the M wave. This is a muscle compound action potential. And that gives us a good idea of the signal transmission from the stimulation point to the muscle. And what we observe is that when you are in a hot ambient condition, you have a decrement in the amplitude of the M wave as compared to temperate environment. This decrement can be observed both at rest or during exercise, and this decrement is not affected by any intervention on the supraspinal area, such as, for example, brain cooling. So it seems that there is a failure of the peripheral nervous system. Using the same kind of stimulation, but if you do not use a supramaximal intensity of stimulation on the nerve, but use a very low intensity of stimulation on the nerve, you will selectively activate the afferent fiber, and for example, the 1A afferents coming back from the muscle spindle to the spinal cord. So you can electrically induce the same response than a stretch reflex. I think all of you already got some stretch reflex being tested during medical screening. When you give a tap on the quadriceps tendon, you generally stretch the leg. So you can induce the same response by electrically activating the 1A afferents. And what you observe here as well is that there is a decrease in the amplitude of the H reflex response with hyperthermia as compared to normothermia. And this decrease in H reflex amplitude occurs irrespectively of the stimulation intensity or of the associated M wave, and occur even if you normalize by the M wave that is taking into account the peripheral side. So that strongly suggests the existence of a different spinal modulation of the neural drive in hot ambient condition as compared to temperate ambient condition. So then our question was, can this original result back in 2011 could be explained only by spinal modulation and or peripheral failure, or are they related to any supraspinal differences when you are in hot ambient condition? So what we did the same kind of sustained contraction over 2 minutes, but every 30 seconds we check the M wave and the H reflex. What we observe is that effectively, when you are in hot ambient condition, you have a decrement in the M wave and in the H reflex. That can explain the difference at the beginning, from the beginning of the contraction, or during brief contraction. But when you sustain the contraction, you have an additional decrement in voluntary activation only in a hyperthermic situation, not in the normothermic situation. And this additional decrement was not related to any differences in H reflex or M wave. So that means that when you do a sustained contraction, then you have a supraspinal failure. But this supraspinal failure, as I said before, could come itself from 2 different origins. That could come from the motor cortex and a decrement in the excitability of the motor cortex. And various studies have been done using some TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, in which you use a magnetic field to directly activate the motor cortex. First one has been done by the team of Simon Gandevia, publication from Todd in 2005, and we did ourselves a few of these studies. And results here are quite inconsistent, and it seems that actually hyperthermia by itself is not altering the excitability of the motor cortex. Conversely, when you look upstream of the motor cortex and some other brain area, it is quite obvious that under some circumstances you have a decrement in cognitive function with hyperthermia. And here, rather than the H reflex or the M wave were not affected by cooling the head, some of this decrement can be recovered by selectively cooling the head, even if the participant is still hyperthermic. So this is a specific supraspinal failure. So hyperthermia decreases the level of neural drive reaching the muscle, and this is due to a mix of peripheral nervous system failure, spinal modulation, and supraspinal alteration. So then the next question would be, when does this alteration occur? And to try to answer this question, we did this kind of very long study with a slow cooking during 5 hours, in which we test our participants every 1 hour and a half, so every 0.5 degree of core temperature. We keep them in a controlled condition at a temperature close to 37, and so in the hot condition, we test them around 37.5, 38, 38.5, and 39. And what we observe is that cognitive function can be altered by 2 different triggers, either at the onset of heat exposure, then after, once the participant gets used to the heat, cognitive function normalized, even if its central temperature increase, and cognitive function become altered again once the participant reach hyperthermia, a temperature close to 39 degrees. But this model of evolution seems to be specific to cognitive function, and neural alteration do not follow the same pattern. Actually, neural alteration seems to have a dose-response relationship, as already evidenced in the first slide that I show you, with a progressive decrement in voluntary activation with hyperthermia. And we verify this response both during passive and active hyperthermia. So we have this kind of failure occurring only in the case of hyperthermia. Why do we have this kind of failure with hyperthermia? And if you look at the old literature on that from the 70s and the 80s, the dominant theory has been that when you hit an organ or when you hit a nerve, chemical reaction occur faster. So, as a response to heating, nerve conduction velocity is also faster because you have a shortening of the time that the voltage gate sodium channel will remain open. So as a consequence, as you can see here, your action potential will reach the muscle earlier in the heat than in temperate environment. But because you reach it earlier, it is also of a shorter duration, and consequently, the depolarization time be shorter, it's also of a lower amplitude. However, recently, some other hypothesis has been proposed coming from animal model, and especially coming from some study done on Drosophila, this is a kind of fly, suggesting that actually with hyperthermia, you could have a synaptic failure. So when you stimulate the presynaptic element in a normothermic condition, you always record an action potential on the postsynaptic element. When you increase the temperature, then you start to see some failure. So some activation of the presynaptic element do not activating the postsynaptic element. And in this Drosophila, when you reach a nerve temperature of 35 degrees, the transmission of the action potential from the pre to the postsynaptic element totally stopped. So we try to apply this idea of a possible failure of the synaptic transmission to our result on H reflex. The H reflex is a monosynaptic reflex, so it's quite a good model to study the behavior of motor synapse in human. And what we did this kind of doublet H reflex in which you stimulate twice the same nerve at the same intensity but with different frequency. And when you do that, with enough rest in between the two stimulation, you can see that the first and the second reflex response are of the same amplitude. But when you increase the frequency of stimulation, you can see that the second response is decreasing in amplitude until totally disappearing. So we call that the HPAD, homosynaptic post-activation depression. Sorry for the term, it's a bit barbare that. But it's giving us a good idea of the recovery capacity of the synapse. And you obtain this kind of curve showing you the recovery time of the synapse. And we did that on two different muscles. It's why we have two different curves, but they are roughly the same. And what was interesting is that actually we did not observe any difference between normothermic and hyperthermic participant. So hyperthermia is decreasing the amplitude of the H reflex of the first one, but is not changing the recovery response of the spinal synapse. Then the idea of faster nerve conduction velocity that can alter the amplitude of the action potential might also apply to the muscle itself. Generally, when you are in hot ambient condition and with a warmer muscle temperature, you observe a shorter contraction time of the muscle twitch, mainly due to a faster half relaxation rate. So it has been suggested that actually to reach tetanus, you might need a higher frequency of stimulation to be able to reach fusion of the twitch. And this hypothesis has been first proposed in the study by Todd from the team of Gandevia in 2005, in which they consider that actually the increased central fatigue during hyperthermia may represent a failure of descending voluntary drive to compensate for changed muscle properties. So we look at that directly at the level of the muscle in a study that we did with Julien, and we directly activated the muscle as different frequency at 10 Hz, 20 Hz, 50 Hz, and 100 Hz. And here is a 8-second train of stimulation. It was, I should not say that, but it was quite painful. And what you can see is that effectively, when you are at low frequency, you do not reach the same fusion in hot ambient conditions and in temperate conditions. So consequently, the level of force for the same stimulation, for the same neural drive, for the same motor drive is lower in the heat. But as soon as you reach fusion and a high frequency closer to physiological frequency and a high level of force, this level of force here was around 70% of MVC. So as soon as you reach this kind of stimulation and level of force, the difference disappears between normothermia and hyperthermia because the centrally mediated neural drive is sufficient to overcome the increase in peak relaxation muscle rate. So the question of why remains partly open. Is it a faster nerve conduction velocity or a synaptic failure that alters the neural drive? Has not been solved yet. And this is a very important question because that directly linked to my next point about the who. By who, we mean who will be affected by this neural failure. Is an inhabitant from a hot country protected from that? Can you acclimatize to that? Can acclimatization protect your neural system? If we consider this first explanation, then the decrease in neural drive transmission is just a side effect of a faster nerve conduction velocity. And you can probably not adapt to that. And by the way, a faster nerve conduction velocity is having some advantage as well. For example, that allow you to maintain your reaction time despite some cognitive failure. But if we consider this second possibility, that the alteration in neural drive transmission is due to synaptic failure, then animal models suggest that you can adapt to that. If you test, for example, the synapse in a bath containing some HSP, you will not have the same rate of failure in the synaptic transmission. So we try to develop the idea actually that if this second hypothesis is the one explaining the decrement in neural drive, then human and athlete should be able to acclimatize to that. And we are currently testing that, and I was in the lab this morning before the conference actually testing that, and I managed yesterday to get my 4 first participants finished, so I will show you just some preliminary data on 4 participants here. So we got some endurance athlete, and in this kind of athlete you can obtain some very high H/M ratio. So in a temperate environment, the amplitude of the H reflex is around 84% of the one of the M wave in this kind of athlete, but in a hot environment, it was only 45%. So as I said, you have a large effect of hot ambient condition. So then after we acclimate this participant to the heat during 11 days, and we perform again the same post-test, both in temperate and hot environment. And so far, it seems actually that you cannot adapt to this neural failure. We observe the same drop in hot ambient condition relatively to temperate ambient condition after acclimation than before acclimation. So my last point, and I think I am in time, my last point will be about how does this failure will affect performance. Because we have been talking about neural test, but there is no competition about H reflex or M wave so far is not an Olympic discipline yet. So when we talk about performance, how will this alteration really affect your performance? So if you look at some participants doing an incremental test in hot ambient condition on the gray line or in temperate condition on the black line, effectively, you can see that the muscle electrical activity, so the EMG, keep in mind all of the limitations that I said during my first slide, is much lower when you stop to exercise in the heat than when you stop to exercise in temperate environment. Does that mean that it's much lower because you were not able to activate more? Not necessarily. For example, in this case, so the participants stop cycling with EMG activity 24% lower than in a temperate environment. But when you test their EMG activity during a maximum voluntary contraction, then the drop was only of 15%. So why did they stop 24% lower in the heat? And in the same time that they stopped with a much lower EMG activity, they were stopping actually with a maximal heart rate in the 2 conditions. So then we ask ourselves, is it really a limiting factor? Yes, you have alteration, but does that mean that this is a limiting factor for prolonged exercise? And we obtained some quite interesting result on peripheral fatigue following an incremental exercise in a normothermic or a hyperthermic state. So what you can see here on the plain line are the result in a normothermic participant, and in the dashed line, the result in hot ambient condition. And you can see that at rest, the level of the peak twitch, so here is one subject and here is the average, was the same irrespective of the ambient condition. When you perform an exercise, the same absolute exercise, 20 minutes of cycling at the same absolute intensity, you have an effect of fatigue. So you have a decrease in the peak twitch. But this effect of fatigue, in response to the same absolute exercise, was the same in hot and in a temperate ambient condition. And then, if you pursue the exercise with an incremental exercise up to exhaustion, you reach a higher level of fatigue in temperate than in hot ambient condition. Because in hot ambient condition, you stop to exercise earlier, so the level of neuromuscular fatigue than you reach is lower than in temperate environment. Acknowledging that we are talking about a laboratory model that was an incremental exercise. So the total amount of work was different. If you consider maybe a time trial or a self-paced exercise in which you will have the same total amount of work, you probably will not observe this kind of result. So if I try to build a story with all of these basic questions that I went through, so we have that hyperthermia will reduce the amount of neural drive reaching the muscle. This reduction is partly due to a mix of peripheral nervous system failure, spinal modulation, and supraspinal alteration. This alteration occurs only when you reach hyperthermia. They do not occur in response to hot ambient condition. They occur in response to hyperthermia. Then they could be explained by either a faster nerve conduction velocity or a synaptic failure. We don't know yet, but that will be determining if we can adapt to that or not. But they are probably not the limiting factor in most of the case. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastien, for the very nice presentation. There's an issue for me that it is very hard to grasp. You conclude that there's a limitation or reduction in neuroactivation during heat stress. However, your data during the same absolute intensity shows that the neuroactivation is the same. So my comment is, based on the literature of the measurement of EMG during constant exercise, if anything, you see that EMG activity actually increases exponentially before you fatigue. And if you are hyperthermic, that occurs faster. So my question is, how can you get an increase in muscle EMG activity with hyperthermia in a situation where a central neural drive is diminished?
It's a very, very good point, effectively. The thing is, in most of the exercise, so when you consider a cycling exercise, for example, you are quite far away of your maximal drive capacity. And it's what we come back here. Yeah. So what we said here is that the decrement in your maximal drive capacity was of 15% only. So then you will wonder, okay, if you have this 15% decrement in your capacity to bring neural drive to the muscle, that should limit effectively, as you mentioned, your ability to increase the EMG during a constant load exercise with fatigue. But even so, during this kind of exercise, the amount of EMG that you use to drive your muscle is much lower than the amount of EMG that you use during a maximal voluntary contraction. So yes, you have a decrement in the maximal capacity to transmit the neural drive from the brain to the muscle. But maybe that this neural drive is still sufficient to bring the required neural drive to the muscle. So that does not mean that the fact of a decrement does not mean that it's a limiting factor, because there is still some availability.
One possibility that you can address that it is by doing constant exercise and stopping the subjects every minute or something like that, and then you have central neural drive effects during the exercise and compared to the control as well. Because ideally, you have to have those measures during exercise. That's the key measure. You are doing it after exercise where things, and as you very well say, you're looking the capacity, but that's not necessarily what happens during exercise. Thank you.
So, just to go back on this question, actually, you are very right. We should get this kind of measure during the exercise. And we try to do that by doing, I did not present this data, but by doing some transcranial magnetic stimulation while the participants were cycling. It's a bit technically challenging to do that, to control really the position of the participant, but we trigger the stimulation every time that the pedal was passing at the same angle to try to control for the position and everything. And in this study, but participants didn't really reach hyperthermia, we did not observe decrement in the transmission of the neural drive. So it was a bit conflicting with some other study when we reach hyperthermia passively. So what is possible actually is that the effect of exercise might overcome the effect of heat. So the decrement that you will have with active hyperthermia is not necessarily bigger than the decrement that you have with passive hyperthermia or that you have with an exercise alone in a temperate environment. So the fact that passive hyperthermia induces some decrement, if the exercise induces the same, you already reach the same limiting factor in a temperate environment. I'm not sure I really answered to your question, but